There we go. Good morning, everybody. We'll give us just a few seconds to kind of let you filter in, and then we'll get started. All right. Happy Wednesday. Welcome to the Centralina Area Agency on Aging October webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about 60 Years Strong, the Older Americans Act and its legacy. We're very excited. Just for real quick, we're going to go over a slide that goes over some of the Zoom webinar features if you're not familiar with those. Let's see, and I forgot I'm the one changing the slide, so here we go. So you are automatically muted whenever we are in Zoom webinar mode. You cannot see the other participants, but you will be able to see speakers and hosts and Debbie Lee. And then if you have any questions, we'll be able to put those in the chat box. We are recording today's session. We will post that on our website for you guys to share afterwards. And then also you will get a certificate of attendance if you are here with us today. And so now I'm going to turn things over to Katie. She's going to introduce Amy.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Katie Cutter, and I'm an Assistant Director for the Centralina Area Agency on Aging. We're very excited to have Amy Gottwals with us today. Amy Gottwals joined U.S. Aging in September of 2005 and currently serves as the Chief of Public Policy and External Affairs. In her role, Amy leads U.S. Aging's public policy, advocacy, external relations, and membership relations activities. Representing local aging agencies, Amy serves as the lead in outreach to Congress and the administration to ensure that needed resources and support services are available to older Americans and their caregivers. Amy has 30 years of public policy, lobbying, and grassroots organizing experience. She has represented groups including the Older Women's League, the Center for Science and Public Interest, the Alliance of Nonprofit Mailers, and the National Network for Youth. Amy holds a Bachelor of Arts in American Studies from Mount Holyoke College and earned a Master of Legislative Affairs from George Washington University. Amy, we're so grateful to have you with us here today, and we'll turn things over to you.
Great. Thank you, Katie and Caitlin, and hi, Debbie. Nice to see your face again. And good morning, everyone. I'm so excited that we get to talk Older Americans Act. It is the piece of legislation, the law, even the regulations around it are all very close to my heart. As you can hear, I worked a bunch of places here in DC over 3 decades, but I have been at US Aging for 20 years. And that's because I'm so honored to get to be a voice in Washington, DC for our incredible US Aging members, including Centralina, a longstanding and consistent member, and with Centralina's director, Linda Miller, serving on our board for many, many, many years and being extraordinarily engaged. And we've even stolen some of Centralina's staff to work at US Aging. Very excited to get to join you this morning and talk about my favorite piece of legislation. Not only am I going to give you some of the backstory and talk about how that informs aging services today, but I also want to make sure that we talk about, well, what's the current legislative status? Because we have an act that's unauthorized right now, which is okay, and I'll explain why. It sounds very scary, but it's okay for now. And certainly in the middle, I'm joining you here on, let's see, day 22 of a government shutdown, and that affects the provision of aging services under Older Americans Act. So the end of my remarks, I'm going to get into some policy details. So I'm just foreshadowing that in case, you don't want to hear that part, you'll know that that's coming up as well. So just disclaimer, I mentioned this, US Aging represents the local area agencies on aging around the country. We're also an advocate for the nation's more than 280 Title VI Native American aging programs. And the Title VI, we'll talk more about that as we get into it. But I offer this up not because you have to know deeply about our organization, but know that we are a nonpartisan national 501c3, so charitable organization. We're a membership association. And so our bias, if you will, is very pro AAA, pro area agency Aging Pro Title VI, we advocate, of course, ultimately for older adults, caregivers, and many of our members serve people of all ages with disabilities. That's the same target population you all are trying to serve. We just do it through the lens of AAA's and Title VI programs. So let's dive into Older Americans Act. And hopefully, since you all are so engaged as providers and staff and volunteers and other leaders and advocates within the aging network there in Central Ina is PSA, you're already pretty aware of the changing demographics. And I know North Carolina is in that bucket of very fast growing aging population. I will tell you that there's not a state that can't say their aging population isn't growing. This is absolutely a nationwide trend. But it's a matter of how fast you're growing. And I know North Carolina for years has been in the group that is among the fastest having a rising aging population. Now, of course, this is a good thing and offers a lot of benefits for our society, but it also offers some challenges. And that's why programs like the Older Americans Act and other policies that affect older adults' ability to age at home and in the community are so important. We have to deal with this demographic change. We've known it was coming for a very long time, but policymakers in DC and often at the state and local level, not aging agencies, we've all known it's coming, but other policymakers have not prepared for what we call the aging of our nation. And we also know, of course, and this is AARP data, and they do this survey very, very frequently. So the number fluctuates a little, but most of us, as we age, want to be able to stay in either your own home or a different home of your choosing for as long as possible. People do not necessarily want and plan for living in institutions such as nursing homes or others. This is where people want to be. So we need to support that. And that is exactly the premise of the Older Americans Act. With one exception on one program we'll talk about, the Older Americans Act is designed to create these, what we would now call social care, but just generally speaking, social services in the community to support healthy aging, to maximize one's independence, to help support people where they want to be as they are on their aging journey. So we have to go back to 1965, and that's, of course, why this summer in July, we celebrated the 60th anniversary of the Act. So I'm glad we're taking some time to celebrate this landmark piece of legislation, and most importantly, what it does every single day in communities, even in a shutdown, is still doing to support older adults and moving forward. And here you can see then President Lyndon Johnson signing it. I want to note that that was an extraordinarily busy summer for Congress. It's kind of amazing with the gridlock we often have in DC now to look back and say, holy smokes, not only did they create Older Americans Act, they also created Medicare and Medicaid in the same summer. And this summer, those programs also celebrated 60th anniversaries. And it's also, now people just get out of DC in the summer. It's too hot. So I don't know why things happened in the summer. But this summer, we also celebrated the 90th anniversary of Social Security, right, from 1935. And so over time, as Congress revisited the Older Americans Act and what it had initially created, they created and built out what I referenced already, and you may not even know you're a part of, although many of you do, which is a national aging network. Sometimes it's called Aging Services Network. But this focus on creating options at home and in the community, you know, our language changes over time. I'm not sure they said it exactly that way, but that was the intent of the act. It was focused on older adults, interestingly, had a different age of, if you will, I'm using this term loosely, eligibility. That's why OA is different. They focused on age 60. I'm not really sure why. Our members have fought to keep it that way for a long time. Part of this is also trying to reach people and the earlier end of their entry into older age. Obviously, we're all aging all the time since we're born, but say maybe people coming up in my demographic, in my mid, as of the weekend, 56. So reaching people a little sooner than the Medicare eligibility age or others, or when people start to perhaps choose to leave the workforce, because so many of our programs focus on that healthy aging. And because there's so many people for whom it's such an individual process aging. And so those who might need services and support sooner than 65 based on their health challenges, their lifestyle, their socioeconomic factors. Real quick, just to give you I'm going to be a little policy wonk on you here just for a minute. The development of the Older Americans Act was not just influenced by the needs of older adults over time or the opinions of AAAs or nutrition providers, although it was influenced by all those things as it should be. But it also was influenced by the type of policy making that was going on in Washington, D.C. at the time. So obviously, big summer of 1965, the Great Society efforts, and this is one of the pieces for how this was a key part of that triangle of or what do I mean? Three-cornered stool, almost a different one than the traditional one about your sources of income in retirement, but the idea being that the government has a role to help lift up those who need some additional assistance to live well and with health, and particularly on their aging journey. But in the 70s, the emphasis switched a little, and in the Nixon administration, there was emphasis on what was called new federalism, and that's where we saw emphasis on not having everything up at the federal government level, but deeper into community. And that, we'll get to that, but that is why AAAs were created. That this idea is, well, the feds have a role in supporting and national leadership, but let's send some of this money and decision making down to a more local level. There's always a lot of programs, of course, that are heavily influenced by state decision making, but the Older Americans Act is special, and we wouldn't even have our association if in the early 70s, Congress wasn't looking for a way to better support the development of these services at a local level. And that's how area agencies on aging were created. As we moved into the 80s, Medicaid, home and community-based services waivers were gaining steam. Experimentation was happening by the states. There was a focus on nursing home reform. And so that part of the act that isn't about aging and supporting aging at home and in the community, the program I mentioned, there's a long-term care ombudsman program to protect the rights of those who are residing in some sort of institutional care, assisted living, nursing homes. So you can see that as there was a concern or an opportunity or a new approach to how we should structure these services, and of course, who was elected in Congress and had an interest in these programs. So here's another way to look at this, and this is sort of a top to bottom being more recent flowchart of where in the OAA's history different programs were added. The nutrition program wasn't actually added till 1972. A year later, AAAs were created, focused. A program was added around community service employment. That's now Title V of the Older Americans Act. So they had money going out to states between 65 and 73, but there was a thought of, we really need someone more local to develop these services, not just wonderful community-based providers who often, not always, specialize in one service, but someone to do the planning and development. How do we take this federal funding? How do we leverage state dollars from the state units on aging, as well as local dollars? Who are the people who are kind of creating these options? Because the philosophy of the Older Americans Act is about meeting people where they are. What are your needs? It's not a one-size-fits-all solution by any means. Okay, so I could talk forever about this, so I'm gonna just point out a few more historical points. Title VI programs added in 78. That's when home delivered meals were specifically added in the act, and you can see several others, including the creation of a standalone title or subtitle rather for the National Family Caregiver Support Program in 2000, so just 25 years ago. What you need to know is there are certain patterns. You can't exactly tell it in the years that these bills were reauthorized, but that's what's happening. An update of the statute. This is not this slide is not representing where maybe a pot of funding, say for congregate programs, got an increase in funding. This represents where Congress went in and actually changed the law that then when funding is provided by a separate set of committees in Congress, then the Area Agency on Aging, with guidance from their state units, then goes and works with providers to implement the act. So this is when Congress, periodically, on average 3 to 5 years, most typically 5 years, takes Older Americans Act statute or law off the shelf and turns to the advocacy community and says, What should we change? Are there barriers? Is there anything else getting in your way? Are there opportunities? What are the changing needs in your communities? And that is a process we're currently underway with Congress. So if we pull back a moment away from all of the changes to the statute and all this policy piece, fundamentally, there are about 5 core buckets. This is not totally comprehensive because it doesn't represent the important Title V with community service and employment training. But these are the main buckets, and they're certainly all areas that all area agencies on aging work at the local level with their partners to develop these types of services. These are the largest buckets. But if you look at Title I of the Older Americans Act, now there's no money associated with this title. It's more of a declaration of objectives. So, I point this out to you because you need to know that back in 65, I think anyone who worked on that legislation then would look back, look at how much we're funded at now and be aghast. This is not the funding that should have flowed, that we are, for all the amazing work the Aging Network does, you could use a lot more resources to be able to not only just serve more people, but be able to offer an even wider array of flexible services to help meet people's individual needs. But if you look at Title I, there are some big goals set here. The act could do any and all, should be focused on assisting older adults for all of these. And you can see that, of course, many of these have direct sources of funding in the act and many others do not. Doesn't mean our network hasn't found ways to address these in one way or another, but certainly the funding, since that ended up on the discretionary side of the federal lender, meaning Congress has to specifically fund it every year, and when they don't, we have a shutdown, different than Medicare and Medicaid, which the government funds on an entirely different side of their financial ledger. Okay, we'll talk more about that later. So jumping ahead, you've got 7 titles in the Act. They've been updated over time, every time Congress has a reauthorization. Title II creates the federal agency responsible for administering these programs. That is there and still called the Administration on Aging. A few years ago in the Obama administration, they put an umbrella over the Administration on Aging that incorporated disability and put the disability programs that were somewhere else in the federal government under the new umbrella and kept the Administration on Aging. So you often hear this referred to as Administration for Community Living, but in the law, it's still a discrete Administration on Aging, and it does still exist. It's Title III of the Act that gets into the good stuff. The grants that go out to states and then are leveraged by AAAs. Funding is added at every part of the process of Older Americans Act, all the way down to consumer contributions and voluntary donations that come in. And so we've got several key titles that I want to touch on here. I've started listing them, but I think my slides cover them going a little more deeply, so I'm going to jump ahead. One of my favorite titles in my favorite act is Title IIIB, Supportive Services. This title is the second largest program after the nutrition programs as far as dollars that Congress has given, but it is far broader on what area agencies on aging could do and fund with this pot of money. I know North Carolina works a little differently. Your state puts a few things together before it hits the AAAs, so it's hard to see these lines, but that you're special in that way with your block grant as the money comes from the feds. But I'll point out that this is still a discrete pot of money, and every year we fight for more funding for this because it allows area agencies on aging to give the in-home help people need, transportation, chore services, home modifications, some funding not only to support activities in senior centers, but in some cases, money just to sustain the senior center, legal services, adult day, and it's been such a flexible pot of money that in COVID and even after COVID, this has been a place where AAAs have turned for authority and for funding to add enhanced social engagement activities. We know that's a through line through all titles of the Act is the social engagement, prevention of social isolation. But in the burst of additional activity over the last decade that our network has done, we know that a lot of that funding has come from Title IIIB. And also critically, if you can have the best services, but if people don't know how to find them, don't even know they exist, or are not sure how to go in different places for different services, and the complexity that would add to someone's life when, if they're needing assistance, their life is probably a little more complex than they'd like it to be and need a little support. And so I want to point out that Title III-B is also the funding mechanism at that local level for information, referral, and assistance. Those are the call centers there at Centralina. There may be different terms for these. I'll let any translation happen from Caitlin and Katie, but know that this is true of all AAAs have this function, as well as case management and helping people with a whole host of things. And, you know, a lot of AAAs use some of this money to help people pick their Medicare plans. If they're funding from other sources that's dedicated to that support are inadequate, this is another key funding source for these issues. And I'll note that going up a level, I'm skipping your state. I don't mean to. I don't know their number that's statewide or ADRC network to help people connect across North Carolina, but know that there is a federal call center called the Elder Care Locator. These are our current hours. We actually, our nonprofit association that's independent of government has successfully competed and received the grant to operate this. So I'm disclosing that we actually have this. I have colleagues right around the corner from my traditional little office space who are on calls all the time, answering calls from consumers, as well as from people, professionals in the Aging Network. It's a great way to find out what other resources might be available that might not be in your community, or calling it for someone in another state. And you think, I know how North Carolina works. I know how our AAA works, but how does it work in another place? So I'm flagging that. And I'm also letting you know that while we don't print as many of these as we used to, we still have a wealth of materials that can be customized to your local area. If you're doing this for nonprofit providers can use to educate older adults on and caregivers, importantly caregivers, on a whole host of aging topics. And we'll be releasing our latest brochure and campaign this fall, and it's going to be around the importance of nutrition as we age. So look for that going forward. But I started with 3B because it's the first letter. I don't really even know what A is. It doesn't matter. It's not a funded program. Title III-C, the largest pot of funding, and in the Older Americans Act by a lot. And of course, the most famous of home delivered and congregate meals programs fall into this category. Then, of course, I don't know why my slide has these not in alphabetical order. I apologize, but I'll just stick with what the slide says. As I mentioned before, in 2000, there was a new subtitle added at that point, the last letter in this Title III that is dedicated to caregivers, offering respite, support, navigation, health, caregiving. So again, I'll let Caitlin and others tie the connections to what they're calling it at Centralina, or if you're a provider joining us today, maybe you're supporting this work and you have a name for what you call your service. But no, all of this starts often with this foundation of federal funding. And then, of course, Title III-D, this is unfortunately a very small pot of funding. It is about $26 million for the whole country, which it does not go far. And Congress several years ago said, hey, you've had this pot of money focused on disease prevention, health promotion. We are going to tie your hands a little and say this must be evidence-based programs. Well, the network thought, oh, well, that's a lot more and is a more expensive way to do this, but boy, then we'll have the data and then maybe Congress will give us more money. Unfortunately, they have not increased that proportionately. So it's a critically important role for the Aging Network to offer these classes, to create these opportunities for people. I've listed some of the more famous evidence-based programs that the Aging Network carries on. Most common, I guess maybe I should say more common than famous, but being evidence-based, we know they work. And so these are happening in communities around the country. And many of sectors of the Aging Network, both AAAs and providers, have been also seeking other sources of funding outside the Older Americans Act to be able to serve more people with evidence-based programs, Medicare and Medicaid. So that's a conversation for another day, but just know that the inadequacy of Older Americans Act funding, our network is certainly constantly looking to supplement with other funding sources so we can meet the mission of the act, which is creating these options for folks. I've mentioned a couple times Title V, Senior Community Service Employment Program. This is for low-income older adults, and they can be younger than age 60 who need to work. They may also want to work, but they financially need to work, and their skills may be out of date to the current workforce. And so that's a critical program. It's the only part of the Act that is not administered at the federal level by the Department of Health and Human Services. It is administered, excuse me, by the Department of Labor. I mentioned Title VI. This is funding that skips states and goes straight from the feds to a competitively selected group of tribes and tribal organizations. And this serves to supplement the Services Under Older Americans Act. Obviously, if I'm an elder in a tribal community or living outside that community, but still Native American, Native Hawaiian, Native Alaskan, these are additional services offered in culturally sensitive ways. Another way to supplement what they can. I'm sorry, I didn't say that very well. Those elders can, of course, access all the other services I've just talked about. But as we saw in 1978, Congress wanted to make sure there was some dedicated funding for those tribal organizations to also supplement and serve. And AAAs and Title VI are supposed to coordinate that so that there's not any unnecessary duplication, but there's good connectivity and making sure folks, these particularly vulnerable populations, are getting what they need. And then I mentioned the Long-Term Care Ombudsman Program and other efforts to prevent elder abuse are what fall under Title VII of the Act. What's the structure? I've referenced this a couple times, and I've probably dropped the name of area agencies on aging, or AAAs, many times. But as I've said, it's so helpful to have a visual. So we have the federal government. We have 56 state units on aging. That includes several key territories in Washington, D.C., if you're wondering how they got to 56 and not 50. There's 613 area agencies on aging around the country. And then there are estimated at least 20,000, give or take, local service providers who the AAAs then contract with to deliver that service or be a partner for part of the delivery of that service. And so all together, this is our network. As I mentioned, tribes are funded directly by the federal government. That's because of their tribal sovereignty. And so they don't want to answer to states because they have sovereignty. So that's why they are off the chart. It is not dismissive. In fact, it reinforces their roles as tribes and the federal government's recognition of them as federally recognized tribes. There are a few states, just a little FYI, if you've got relatives in Rhode Island or Alaska or Delaware or Wyoming, those states do not have that area agency on aging structure. They were allowed a long time ago to decide to build it out or not. And if you at all know our small East Coast states of Delaware and Rhode Island, they are quite small. And I think the reasoning was, do we really need to subdivide? And then when you have states like the Dakotas and Wyoming, there's an issue of not as many people over a large area. Again, does it make sense to subdivide? And so those states don't have AAAs, but it is otherwise chosen. One other key about this, and again, here are these set of services. All AAAs offer these services under Older Americans Act. So we're all doing the same work with the same goal. But we recognize that depending on how these programs have flowed in states, the AAA may look different. So you all have regional AAAs, large, not, I think this is old memory of mine, so it's probably not right, but I feel like Central Atlanta covers like 9 counties. But in Pennsylvania, a AAA is most likely to be in 1 county and reside in the county. Same for much of New York State. But councils of government and other forms of government are more common in the Southeast and the Southwest. And then through the Midwest, we have a very strong group of standalone nonprofits operating AAAs. So there are differences, but again, the goal is focused. And one thing I want to linger on here too is that the AAAs have a particular advocacy role. And we quote the statute when we need to, because in addition to developing these services, this part of the Older Americans Act charges area agencies on aging in particular be an advocate and focal point for older adults. So it's not just we offer the services, but we should be championing other aspects of the older adults in the communities and caregivers' needs, and be able to speak out, whether that's informing Congress, working with your state legislatures to get more money, of course, working within government with your state unit on aging, but where else should the AAAs around the country be engaging? And so most of our AAAs, whether they sit in government or not, are still advocating with other governments and as well as all other policymakers at all levels. This is really an amazing, beautiful act, not only because the great work that happens at the local level where you all make it bloom, but it's also about everyone's got skin in the game. There's that foundation of federal work. There's an opportunity for state leadership and investment. Some states invest a whole lot more in their, Older Californians Act or Older Michiganians Act. They add a lot of funding. There's a certain amount they have to add. And I should have looked up whether North Carolina overmatches, but just know that there's room for leadership and investment. And that buy-in and understanding of these programs is what has allowed us to remain out of the fray of national politics and to ensure that every time we are up for renewal, every time we ask for more funding, there is bipartisan support for those pieces. So I just wanted to flag that. I think I'm out of order here in my slides, but I'm just pointing out that while there's variation in AAAs, and my next few slides will point this out for you, that there is still a common role for AAAs. They just might do it a little differently, just as providers. A provider in Montana is going to have a different, first of all, service area and delivery system than someone in downtown Chicago. And so what's wonderful about the act is it allows for that local flexibility, the AAA and any flexibilities they offer their providers. I alluded to this. I should have waited till I had this slide up so it was nice and easy for you. But this is the breakdown of where AAAs sit. And again, this is because Congress gave states flexibility to decide how to set it up. And so they often mirrored what are the power structures in that state as far as, is it a state where all the money goes to counties and counties are the powerful entities? Okay, they probably put their AAAs in counties back in the day. But if they didn't have that and they worked differently, then they moved to more of a regional model. Just to give you a sense of the funding, overall, Older Americans Act, this is an average, is about 39% of AAA's funding. We're going to have new data soon. This is 2-year-old data, but the range is incredible. If you note in the parenthetical remark below that Older Americans Act purple box, it can range from 3% of respondents to our survey 2 years ago to 100%. So we do have some AAAs for whom OAA, and that's often a small county, is their only source of funding, to AAAs that also receive a wide array of other funding. And you can see that in the table I prepared here. So I don't want to spend too much on this. I just think it's often helpful, particularly when our audience is a little wider than AAA staff, to have a sense of the variety around the country. And again, this is median AAA workforce. There's quite the range. Many would be smaller. And you can also, I like this slide because it salutes the fact that we could not do this without volunteers. This has long been an important critical piece of the success of Older Americans Act, is these local volunteers. So if that's you on this call, I salute you. Know that your role is recognized and so critical. And then I'm going to wrap up talking about AAAs, I promise, because I know we're a key part of the Act, but I want to talk a little bit about where the Act stands now. But I'd be remiss if I didn't mention people under the age of 60 with disabilities, because I've been working for US Aging for 20 years, and over the last 10 to 15, there's been incredible growth in AAAs playing roles with that population as well, whether for the formation of aging and disability resource centers or whatever it's called in a various state, and collaborating with existing disability organizations, not to take over that work, but to ensure that all systems lead to help and that coordination happens, as well as other programs sometimes starting up at a state or local level. So we've seen more and more, and as we survey our AAAs every 2 to 3 years, we've seen some interesting growth in these numbers, including serving veterans under age 60. And I've covered a little bit of this, but for those of you who also receive other funding, I'm speaking now to providers, or even if you're within Centralina AAA and know that your job isn't actually funded by Older Americans Act. I just want to share some of the other federal programs that are sending money towards the Aging Network. Not evenly, not by population like Older Americans Act, everybody gets some, but these are the other common sources of funding that start with federal dollars, although are often added state dollars that our members tell us they rely on. But as I said, advocacy is really at the core of what you do, and it's at that core of that Older Americans Act. There's not many pieces. There must be something else out there that does this, but I haven't come across any other piece of statute except the Older Americans Act that then tells people to be that advocate, that gives you permission to do this advocacy. Sometimes Congress gets fussy if they don't like the message. Grantees are saying, they can say like, well, don't advocate for it. I'm like, you're just supposed to do that job, but that's not at the heart and the core of the Older Americans Act. And certainly, if it feels like thinking about that and talking to a senator or advocating or politicians, I don't want to touch that. I can understand people bring their own emotions to thinking about what federal advocacy or state advocacy looks like. But I'll just remind you, you're all in whatever role you're in, a provider for Centralina, a volunteer for Centralina, a staffer, you're all advocating. You're doing it in your work. You are in speaking up for people who need assistance and finding a way to meet that need. And so I always like to just pause for a minute, because don't think of policy as that much different. Policy is just taking all of the experiences you have, and most importantly, the voices of those who you're serving, right? We help amplify their voices. We don't speak for them, but we're there to share their stories, and if they can't be in the room. And so those older adults and caregivers that you're serving, and you are already advocating for them. So it's just a matter of translating those experiences, gathering the data, what it looks like, not just those wonderful individual stories of how Older Americans Act is why they're able to remain in their home, why they're staying independent, why they're able to continue caregiving and support that loved one and not burn out and have to look to other placements, perhaps in a nursing home. We know the Older Americans Act changes people's lives, lifts them up, saves their lives, and you all are doing that incredible work. We need to make sure we tell those stories and have the data to show the impact with policymakers. So with some of my remaining time, and we are going to allow time for questions at the end, I did want to dive a little bit into the federal policy lens. Sorry, this is also my favorite thing to talk about. So just know I will try to tie as much as I can back in these remarks back to what we just were talking about, which is that statute that is the OAA. But we got to talk about, well, what's happening in DC about it now? Okay, this is my kind of depressing slide. I'm going to need another sip of tea before I go ahead. So I'm going to give you a chance to just read what I'm saying here, and I'll dive in a second. I've been doing a lot of traveling around the country this year, talking to other AAAs and their networks, as well as sometimes AAAs gather across a state or across a region, and we need to talk. And I developed this slide at the beginning of 2025, not long after the inauguration and the attempt to freeze all federal funding that was still tied up in the courts. And I thought, I need a slide that just tries to get a handle on the boldness of the Trump administration and the disruption that boldness has caused. And because it's undeniable, it's not like anything else. I've got 30 years in this town, seen an even amount of Republican White Houses and Democratic White Houses and Republican Congresses and Democratic, and you get it. And any combination has looked nothing like what we're in now. It is, you can love it and be cheering it on, and you can hate it and be weeping. It doesn't matter. What we can agree on is that this is unprecedented, the change that's happening, driven largely by President Trump. Congress, they're mostly following him in many ways, to be honest. They're doing things, and they're sort of doing their job most of the time. But as far as the majority of Republicans, they are trying to enact the president's agenda and stay unified. The disruption is largely coming from the style, approach, and goals of the Trump administration. So I hope everyone can appreciate that that's true. And again, I'll leave it to you as individuals, whether you think this is all great or think this is all terrible. But when I tried to kind of pull through that, I could give you an update on this court case or update on that court case because most of these bold moves have been challenged through the courts or pushed back on within the administration, sometimes even quietly. That's how we got a problem solved this spring. We worked within the administration, worked with Republicans in Congress, and said, that's not going to look good for the president. Let's try to fix that before you issue that final statement, and kept OAA safe. But largely, it's about a bunch of power struggles. This is the way that I can look at this because no one wants to detail the court cases. I don't. I'm not a lawyer, and there's so many to keep up with. But what I feel like I'm watching in a way that has not been there before is there's always a Republicans versus Democrats power struggles, right? That's what they exist to do. But now we're seeing a power struggle between the White House and Congress. There's always some of that, right? The president wants his way, Congress wants their way. If they're of opposing parties, that's going to be less fun for everybody. But this is really different because they're all led by Republicans, and they're still surprisingly, Republicans are putting up with kind of getting some of their powers granted to them in the Constitution for the power of the purse. In other words, appropriations measures that have to pass every year. And Older Americans Act funding is all part of those appropriations bills. We don't get our funding until the shutdown's over. But with the president sometimes just not spending money on programs that Congress appropriated, saying he doesn't approve of the program, he doesn't want to spend the money with rescissions, where he did it more appropriately that time and sent measures to Congress and said, well, I know you gave it money, but I don't think we should. So I'm trying to get your permission to cut the program. So he's done it both what many would argue are illegally. And then eventually those Republicans talked to him and I think we're like, no, you can't do it this way. Making us look bad. And then they've come up with other approaches. But there is still a struggle. What is the president's role and what is the Congress's role? And that's playing out because this president and his senior advisors, who certainly planned for all of this, wanted to assert a greater amount of power in the office of the presidency. The president is a much more powerful position in this century than it was in years past, and that's documented by political science folks. So there's always been an increasing growth of the powers of the presidency, particularly as the federal government has grown in size. But this is unprecedented how large of a scope President Trump would like to have. So it's pushing back against Congress. And he's mostly getting his way and not a lot of pushback because, of course, Republicans have control of Congress. But there's also a pushback and a fight with the judiciary. So, and you're seeing this play out, and we won't get into all the court cases that are tied up, but there's also a sense of, dare me, I don't mind drawing a lawsuit. I'm going to continue to say that I think the president should have this power. So we're watching a bigger play that the individual court cases, the individual challenges of, hey, you should fund this. It's all ending up in the courts. Because that's intentional. President Trump and his advisors know that, they want that. That's the way that they would try to build a precedent for having this power. So all of this is going on, and there's Congress trying to do what it already struggles to do well, like pass annual appropriations bills. And so a lot's on the table, a lot of disruptions happening. Meanwhile, within the federal government, we've got wholesale people just gone, just fired, laid off. Some took those early offers to leave, knew that all this was going to end and a lot of people are going to get fired, so took early buyouts. And so we've got a lot of gaps in government. There might be some offices, there have been offices of different agencies where they fired everybody. Sometimes they then realize that was a mistake and they bring someone back, but there have just been incredible disruptions. So it is truly changing DC in a way that no other presidency, including President Trump's first term, is. And then that's causing some disruption in the system that I'll get into. So I hope that was helpful for that context. I think sometimes we have to pull back for maybe an individual issue we care about that we're following the news, but tune out the rest. Whatever your personal thoughts, this is what's happening. It is a series of power struggles that are designed to change the power of the presidency. I mean, they admitted as such. Other executives have pushed the envelope, but this is, I don't know what the next metaphor is, but nothing to do with an envelope. It's much bolder. So how does that affect the federal agency that administers these Older Americans Act programs? So as you'll recall, I said, well, it's technically Administration on Aging, but the Administration for Community Living is the umbrella agency. About half of their workforce is gone. They were laid off originally back in the spring, but didn't ultimately get fired because a court case stopped the firings for a while until July. And unfortunately, they received their final, this is it, you're locked out of your computers, on the day of the 60th anniversary of the Older Americans Act. Coincidence? It was, I'm stating that, not a question. It was a coincidence, but it was a shame. So we have lost all of the regional people who were experts in Older Americans Act, who could help AAAs and states and providers with information. Are we administering the Older Americans Act right? Are we allowed to do this? They were the on the ground folks at 10 federal regions around the country. President Trump and Secretary Kennedy of HHS have narrowed that to 5 regions of the country instead of 10, where they want to put a person. I mean, the regions are still there, but there's only someone there, and there aren't any for the Administration for Community Living. I guess that work they think will be handled by people just within the larger HHS agency. So we had the budget team, the communications team, and the policy team, and all removed from administration for community living. So they're halved. The thinking, of course, if you're wondering, well, why would anyone do that? You've got to get the money out. You've got to communicate. You've got to advertise the webinars. You've got to make sure you're managing the money. This is all part of Secretary Robert, let's look up my names. Secretary Kennedy's reorganization of HHS, some of which has been stopped by the courts because it violates law, meaning Congress set something up to work a certain way. And now you've got, again, the presidency saying, no, we can change these things. So basically within ACL, they got rid of everything that isn't explicitly stated you need to do in the Older Americans Act. And the thinking was, why do all these agencies have within HHS, which is a huge, it's up there with Defense Department as far as largest department of the federal government, why do you all need your own budget teams? So we're going to find out when eventually the shutdown ends and all this funding is being pushed out, what those effects are, because none of the people who know how to run the Older Americans Act formula are really left at ACL. And it's not like they took some of them and moved them up to a bigger budget office. So no one really seems to know, are there enough people to do this work as it comes out? So that's what I mean about destabilizing, boldness, disruption. Okay, I took way too long explaining the context in DC. I want to get a little more focused and remind us where we are in the spending process. Okay, because we're actually in pretty good shape now. So I want to not run out my time and not share some good news. So this is a chart that shows, and the source of the funding is from the Congressional Budget Office, but I've given the folks who made the beautiful slide credit at the bottom of my slide. This is the simplest way to look at the federal budget. It's 3 buckets. We've got net interest on the long-term federal debt. We've got mandatory spending, and we've got discretionary. Older Americans Act is in discretionary funding. This shutdown is only about the 30%. That's why Social Security benefits and Medicare payments continue uninterrupted in a shutdown. Lots of other resources that support those systems are shut down, but the actual benefits out to individuals, it all depends on your funding source. There are 2 types of these funding. Now, the top bar here is the same thing you just saw, just everything subdivided a little further. So all the blue-gray programs you can see, those were all in the largest share of the federal budget, which is mandatory programs. Mandatory programs mean that the funding continues uninterrupted unless Congress changes it. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act that passed this summer with so many of President Trump's tax and spending and cuts priorities, that changed Medicare, Medicaid, and other mandatory programs, but it wasn't allowed. The process they used, they couldn't touch Social Security, but that changed mandatory spending and has an impact. But usually in a year to year, those kinds of bills don't pass. Congress doesn't go in and tinker much with Medicare or Medicaid or Social Security, which is generally a good thing. But so what they really change every year, and every time there's a shutdown, the most part of the funding that can be affected is just 30%, and a little less than half is defense spending. So non-defense discretionary is everything else you can think of in the federal budget. The parks, the people who the field offices of the Social Security, right? The benefits come out of that 23%, but the staffing and critical staff support roles in the federal government come out of non-defense discretionary. Department of Education, foreign aid, which is a tiny part of the 16%. All of the other healthcare spending that's not mandatory, public health, CDC, let's let the Treasury Department, Commerce Department, all of those other programs across the federal government, public service, name another, most of NASA, all of that is in non-defense discretionary. So it's a lot of things people think about when they think of the federal government is sharing that 16%. Okay, so where were we this year? The president's budget, I'm going to do this rapid fire to get through, but we had a little skirmish in the spring where a leaked version of the president's budget came out, and it was really bad for OAA. And luckily it took 6 weeks. We ended up having 6 weeks before the final came out, and we were able to talk quietly with Republican lawmakers to push the Trump administration to fix that draft. We advocated within the administration. I think advocacy happened by the administration with some people advocating from what was appropriate to their role. And we pushed back on this and were able to get that fixed. So when the budget came out in whole, it was really good for Older Americans Act, that programs that reside at HHS. It did not have the proposed cuts. It did not move us to other parts of the government. It was a good thing. However, overall, President Trump's budget that was released at the end of May proposed to take that 16% of the budget and cut it by 22.7%, which is significant. I mean, that's not a haircut, right? That's a deep gouge. That changes things. It wouldn't necessarily be across the board, but how he got to that is by eliminating a lot of programs, including those you see on our screen. There's a lot more than this, but this is where I wanted to focus. These are the programs. They were actually all on an earlier slide when I was saying other sources of funding for the Aging Network. So good news, I promise them. The good news is that both the Republican-led Senate and Republican-led House followed the president's recommendation for the most part on Older Americans Act programs at HHS. And they did not follow his recommendation on those program eliminations, with one exception. So the Senate committee did its spending bill this summer. They level funded all the titles that I was detailing earlier this hour. They preserved that funding to help people enroll in Medicare. And there were a lot of other programs like Senior Corps and Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program and the block grants that they funded. And we were thrilled. And we thought, okay, well, we're a little worried about the House. Well, the House did pretty darn well, and in fact gave us small increases in Title IIIB because we advocated so hard to say, you need meals funding and you need more. You need more of everything in OAA, but you really need to understand how that Title IIIB supports the entire system and can develop person-centered services. And it even increased some of those programs the president voted to block. So this is really interesting that you have the Republican president that with that level of elimination. And if you're wondering, well, why would the Congress not follow all these? They're the ones who have to face the public. So we always knew their budgets would be less dramatically bad. Unfortunately, Title V of the Older Americans Act, the House Republican Committee, Appropriations Committee, or the committee is bipartisan, of course, but this was very much a Republican bill since they hold the majority. That program they did follow the president's recommendation to completely eliminate that program. So Title V remains at risk. So, but overall, besides that, we had two good spending bills, but then Congress couldn't agree on merging those and moving them forward because they weren't done in a bipartisan fashion. If you're wondering why Democrats could have the power to hold up the passage of these spending bills, it all is about the Senate. The Senate, you have to have 60 votes to cut off debate and move to a vote on most pieces of legislation. And that includes these spending bills. Even to just continue the funding as is for a week or a month, in order to buy more time for Congress to finalize these bills, you need 60 senators to say, yep, we can vote on that bill. You don't need 60 votes in favor, but you need 60 votes to cut off any filibusters that senators would do. So that is why in the past years, and sometimes when Democrats are in the lead and sometimes Republicans are in the majority and sometimes one chamber's one and one's the other, they ultimately have to get together and find a bipartisan solution to this. It's very hard, which is why often they do these short-term funding patches to buy themselves more time. And in fact, last year, they punted this again and again for 6 months into the fiscal year. And when they finally finished that bill, all it was saying, actually, we're just going to stay where we are for the rest of this year. So that's the dysfunction you're seeing, that they are not able to find bipartisan agreements. And then if this is the only bill that's going to go somewhere, a party, typically Republicans have used this in the past, and now Democrats are taking a tool out of their toolkit and saying, we're going to try this. We're going to be the ones that bring up something that's not related to appropriations and use it as a way to get progress on there. And the result was the shutting down. So that's why Republicans alone can't reopen the government. They don't have the votes in the Senate. If you're wondering then, but this summer, President Trump's big bill that Democrats were pretty universally against, why couldn't they stop that? It's all because they used a different process. And because they were making cuts to mandatory programs, Congress had set up another process that they could use called reconciliation. And they only needed 51 votes to move those bills forward, and they had 53 Republican, and still do, in the Republicans in the Senate. So this really was Democrat. I'm not defending it. We're not pro shutdown at all. We want the federal government reopened. We want them to get a bipartisan solution on all the issues so that funding can flow out to the field. But know that's kind of what led to this, is they have to get buy-in from Democrats to do this. And I think Democrats thought this is our only chance. We couldn't stop the big spending bill this summer. Excuse me, not a spending bill. It was some spending and some cuts and tax cuts. Okay, so I have no crystal ball anymore. They're all broken. DC is not what it was. Again, you can cheer it or worry about it. I'm just telling you, my crystal balls are broken. It seems like, as of yesterday, there's starting to be buzz that some members of both parties are starting to really, kind of separately though, they're not doing it in a bipartisan way yet. I think Republicans are starting to realize they're going to have to give somewhat on the Affordable Care Act subsidies. And certainly the closer we get to November 1, the more consumers are starting to see the rates that they'll pay without those subsidies. So I think that's going to put pressure on Republicans. Democrats, this is not like them. They're not usually the ones that shut down the government because they usually want this funding. And you see the president putting tremendous pressure on them by trying to fire swaths of workers. The courts have also stopped that, as well as picking and choosing who he finds other sources of funding to fund, like the military, and talk of funding other things that he's in support of, including the WIC program. So that sort of picking and choosing, which the courts will have to decide, but I think it's illegal. He's doing that to put pressure on them. So both sides are under a lot of pressure, and I really hope that they are able in the next week to start having a serious conversation of how they get us out of this. But the key point I want you to understand, and I promise I'll really stop talking, is that it's going to take many weeks, a month and a half after a shutdown for this funding to actually reach even the state. At least for this money to get to a state. And then if you add in the time it takes the state to allocate out to AAAs, and then if you're a provider, that's even more time. So just know that that is I'm calling it a shutdown hangover. And I don't think Congress fully understands how long it takes. And because of how the entire budget staff of Administration for Community Living is gone, because the Trump administration has had a level of scrutiny on outgoing federal funding that is bigger than any other presidency, thanks to the DOGE efforts and other things. They've put a lot of extra traps in place. And so that means it takes longer. You might think it's good, but it takes longer. So we're concerned also about this. If we survive, if AAAs are doing all right, the state's infilling federal money. Things are going along. No one's happy about this, but if you're able to keep services up, just know that there's still going to be a gap on the other side of this shutdown. So we have urged our members, and this was several weeks ago, we started with this saying, you got to tell Congress, you don't have to take a position on what they're fighting about, but we need to say, you need to solve this. And here's the impact on my area. Here's the impact on my organization or a program I care about. And so we gave some advice that I'm showcasing here that talked about what we thought AAA should share. Even if you're able to keep programs going, there is still a longer term impact on not having this funding. It's a disruption. It can make clients anxious about whether these services will still be available to them. And I will tell you, in the last week is when we're starting to see the cracks in the wall. We've got a state in the middle of the country. The state is not helping support the AAAs by infilling funding like I understand North Carolina is. The state, for whatever reason, and it may not be up to the aging person, it may be a higher level. The governor's office said, no, we're not infilling. And so there are reports of some services will be disrupted, as in temporarily halting service. And so this is getting grave in many parts. It really depends in your part of the country how much cash flow the AAAs or the state has, or if they have other sources of funding. So we want the shutdown to end ASAP, and we encourage people in the Aging Network to reach out. And we've given sort of a simple message here where you don't take a position on what the parties are fighting about, but you talk about reopening the government and making sure that moves forward. And lastly, reauthorization. All of that was about the dollars that we need to get every single year. That's usually what we spend our advocacy time on. But as my earlier slide showed, every roughly 5 years, Congress gets involved and updates the law, ideally with a lot of input from those of you who actually see how the law affects real people's lives. We did the entire process, got a beautiful bipartisan bill at the end of last year. It fell out of the end of year spending package. That particular 2-year Congress, the 118th, ended. And so the bill essentially died. It still has tremendous support among the national groups, among AAAs nationwide, and many, many providers. I can't speak for them, I don't represent them, but this is a bipartisan bill that does no harm and does add some added flexibilities and other important updates to the act. It has been reintroduced in the Senate in this new Congress. We are waiting for this handsome gentleman, Republican from Michigan, who is the chairman of the committee. He is of the 4 leaders, so Republican, Democrat, House, Senate, who worked on the bill. He's the only new guy. All the others stayed where they were, or even if they switched majority, minority. So everyone wants this bill done, but he was a new chairman. He's working on other stuff. We have advocated to move it this year. We've gotten some, I wouldn't call them promises. We've gotten some support from him and his staff to try to move this forward, but it is not a big, loud vocals, everybody write to their members of Congress, because in this tricky political environment, we have to make sure we have safe passage of that bill. We don't want to debate everything we spent last year debating. We don't want it caught up in this incredibly political atmosphere. We want to ensure we get yet another bipartisan Older Americans Act reauthorization this year. So I'm way past time. I'll flag that we have resources. These were also developed with the State Unit Association, Advancing States, Meals on Wheels America, NANASP, and National Council on Aging. These are beautiful ways to celebrate the OAA. You don't even have to take a position on appropriations or reauthorization, because all we say is protect the Older Americans Act. There's social media images. Your organizations or you personally can push this out to raise the visibility of the Older Americans Act. So I'm really ending now. I thank you for your time. I'm sorry I went right up against the hour, but I'll turn it back over to Katie and Caitlin, and they'll decide what way we're done, or I could answer questions. So apologies
Everybody's
for
still
going
on
over.
here, Amy. I think that if anybody has questions and you're willing to stay, we're willing to
Okay,
facilitate.
great.
So I'm looking, see if anything comes in.
And I know you answered this question in the chat box earlier, Caitlin, but some folks were asking about the PowerPoint. And so that will be sent out to everyone. And since this is recorded, this is also a great opportunity. You could share it with others, other team members, other individuals who weren't able to be here today. And I really appreciate you ending, Amy, with some kind of action items, right, that we can all take to make sure that we're communicating how important the Older Americans Act is, so that hopefully, of course, all of these services and supports can continue to be supported at the federal level. And of course, we appreciate everybody for joining us today. I'm looking to see any questions, Caitlin.
Just a lot of thank you, thank you, thank you.
A lot of kind North Carolinians being so kind to me. I love your state. You all are so lovely. So I'm glad it was helpful, at least to some of y'all. And it was a pleasure to be here. And know that, turn back to this amazing team and to Linda leading the effort in your area for all these policy and advocacy questions as well. And if they don't have that answer, they have us to check in with at the federal level. So I'm glad to see that the breadth of this webinar, because it's really, I might have talked your ear off about AAAs because that's what I'm paid to do. But it is so important that all levels and connections, and whether we've paid roles or unpaid roles, we work for so-and-so, we work for this entity, that we come together and support the Older Americans Act. It's so critical. And I just want to thank everyone for the roles that you all play. And I have the easy job. Congress isn't easy, but bragging about the work that you guys actually do is pretty darn good. So thank you. Your service is so appreciated.
Thank you, Amy, for being with us. We appreciate you sharing your expertise. So thanks, everyone, and have a great day.
Have a great
Thank
day.
you.